Welcome to Authors in Perspective. I'm Vicki Palmquist. Today, I'm interviewing Sharon Chmielarz, author, poet, and educator. Sharon, a number of years have passed since we first met at a writers' conference. That meeting impelled me to read everything you had written, picture books and poetry books. I learned a good deal about writing poetry from you. I count you among the wise women in my life. I'm delighted we can spend time together today talking about questions I've long wanted to ask you. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much for asking me. It's my pleasure.
Good. What started you on your path of writing poetry?
Well, actually, is my path of writing. I was teaching, and I was teaching a non-essential subject, foreign language, and school boards. Whoever has taught in public schools know that every 10, 12 years there's a school board cut back in programs because they don't have enough money. So they were cutting back. The school board in the district I was teaching in, the school board was cutting back in non-essentials, which included art, music, foreign language, and by it, if you can believe it or not. And so I thought, well, I have really gotten used to getting a paycheck at the end of the month. So I will go back to school and to the U and get a degree in an essential subject, which for me was English because I always loved to read. So I did that. I found it very easy. I would work during the day, and then I'd leave work. I could just make it over to the university at 4:20, which is when the first class began that I took. I loved 4:20 classes, didn't matter what it was, what they were, as long as they fit the 15 hours of literature, 15 hours of writing, et cetera, et cetera. And one of those classes was poetry. And I absolutely, in the teacher, the professor, read a poem, and I thought, oh, that's so beautiful. I want to write. I want to write like that. And it looks so easy in the book because you don't even have to fill a whole page. You know, there are wide margins at the top, bottom, and sides. I mean, who couldn't do that? So that's how I got started.
Oh, and it's not simple. Do you think your years of teaching students influenced your poetry?
Maybe some topics, but I don't I don't think it influenced me. I do the first poem I ever had published, I sent into an elementary school um, journal, teacher's journal. I can't remember the name of it. And I sent it there because it was about a little boy watching an aquarium. So there must have been something in school that made me think this was a worthy topic. But other than that, I really can't. Well, I'll tell you what, one thing it has, teaching did help me. In teaching, you have to be there at a certain time. Your class has to begin at a certain time. You have to let it go at a certain time. And in writing, I find that I carry over those habits. I am at my desk at a certain time in the morning. I am doing something. I don't necessarily write fresh, but I'll take something I wrote by hand maybe the night before, and I will type that in and get that into a file. So I guess it taught me that.
Scheduling. Okay.
Scheduling.
Okay. Very, very good. Um, What was it like when you first had a book published? How did you get there?
Well, it was kind of embarrassing actually, because the publisher called me on June 27th, and I answered the phone. It was one of those wall phones that we used to have in those days. And he told me that the house was taking the book that I had sent in, the manuscript. And I was so happy. I was kind of jumping up and down, and my husband was in the kitchen area with me, and it was our anniversary
Oh
date.
my gosh.
And so I'm sure he just kind of walked backwards from me, because I'm sure he felt, well, this anniversary is truly second rate. She's not jumping up and down as we're going out to dinner. So I will not forget that.
What was that book?
That was called Different Arrangements.
Okay.
And it's based on a quotation from, oh God, a Jane Austen's book, Mansions. And I was in a bookstore. I was in a Barnes and Noble bookstore up in Duluth one summer, and they had a table of Minnesota writers, and there was my book, Different Arrangements. And I was listening in to this woman who was picking up books, and commenting to herself. And I said, I wrote that book. And she said, really? And she flipped it open, and then she flipped it shut again. And she thought it was all about arranging flowers, and that's what she was interested in. Well, there you go. The perils of book titles.
Oh, really? When you pull a collection together, do
Mhm.
you intentionally write each poem to fit the book's topic? Or do you have
Mm-mm.
many poems to choose from? And do you decide not to include some of them?
Mhm. The latter. The title of the book, even in the themes, well, with my book, The Other Mozart, that was in my mind. I knew that I was going to write a biography of this woman in poems. And I had a dickens of a time pulling myself away from the research because it was so interesting. And I am a woman who, as a senior or junior in high school, had to write a research paper along with everybody else in class, and thought it was the most boring thing in the world. But when you are really interested in the subject, and all of these books, one book leads to another book, and just fantastic. So at one point, after a couple of years, I said to myself that I had to stop research. I had to start writing. I had to start writing. So I kind of kept the two together, and then I dropped the research, and I'm sure I could have gone on for a long time. But that book, yes, I had a theme and I followed it. With other books, I don't have an idea. I, after a while, maybe 2 years, I'll think, these poems have something in common. In fact, that is the way I wrote for a long, long time. It was kind of like automated, well, I'd have a file for these poems and a file for these poems. And when I got stuck on one file, I'd switch over to the other file, maybe start another file, and like an automated, what do they call them, in the car factory, where you have these pieces of cars coming down, you add your piece and it goes on. And that I have written, I do use that as a tool. And
Okay.
that's how a book materializes eventually. And then I have to find a title for it.
Do you enjoy finding a title?
It's hard work. What was I writing about? What is this all about?
Uh, um, many poets. You do readings with many of them. How do you differentiate yourself among them?
how do I differentiate myself? What makes me a little different from them?
Mhm.
Well, the topics, definitely the topics, and the style of writing. I'm in this game long enough that I can recognize different styles. Before I couldn't have done that. But everybody has their own style of writing, and I realize that I'm representing my style and so is representing her or their style and so on like that.
Do you have favorite poems and poets?
Yes,
What
but
are
I
one or two of them?
of my favorite poets.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, well, to begin with, when I started writing, it was Elizabeth Bishop. But when I found the Polish poets, Czesław Miłosz and Wisława Szymborska, they both have won Nobel Prizes. They are definitely favorite poets. I love them. And it's kind of interesting that Miłosz, he was born in what is today Lithuania, but it used to belong to Poland. And he writes in Polish, he wrote in Polish. And the young Lithuanian poets reject him because he didn't write in Lithuanian, he wrote in Polish. And anyway, he's old-fashioned. He writes about war and stuff like that. But today, in modern times, and those two will always be really ranking, can hardly get any higher than that. But today, in modern times, I really love Terence Hayes' poetry, and I love Alice Oswald's poetry. She's English, but she wrote a book. She wrote a book of poems about a soldier in the Trojan War. Now you think, oh my God, wake me when it's over. But it is absolutely fascinating. And if if you read any of the Odyssey, or even if you haven't, you get the life of a soldier in those days, which is probably just like the life of
Right.
Ukrainian soldiers today. Only the weapons and the um, uniforms are different. I mean, it's just fantastic.
Wow.
So I really like her work very much.
I
She's
I hope people watching this are taking note. I know I am. Um,
well,
you
buy
just
their books. Sharon Hayes, Hayes.
okay. Okay. Um,
And
you just had a new collection published
mhm,
called Duet in the Little Blue Church.
mhm,
And that includes poems from other collections of yours, as well as never before published poems.
mhm.
What did you have in mind when you began putting this book together?
That was hard. That took me 2, 3 years, and all the poems had already been written. I didn't work on it consistently, but over 2 or 3 years it took. Well, I didn't exactly know how to go about it at first, so I had to try various things. And uh, finally, I just landed on the idea that what are the favorite poems from each selection? What are my favorite poems? And or which poems represent the theme or the topics in each particular book?
Okay.
So from the very first book, it's kind of a wide. Well, I remember putting that book together. I had paper poems all over the living room floor, and I would, uh, and my husband was instructed not to walk into the living room for a few hours. The cats, of course, completely ignored me. But this poem goes with this poem, and this poem goes with this poem, and this poem goes with this poem. And I got that idea from Howard Nemerov. He was at Breadloaf. I did attend Breadloaf when I first started. And even today, I think of a poem and I think, did I put that into duet in the Little Blue Church? And if I don't find it, I think, oh, geez, I wish I would have done this poem in the book too.
I found myself moving back and forth in that book from just selecting a poem here and a poem there, and I would often go back and find the poem to read again. And I really found it a joy. But there were times when I read poem after poem after poem, and I could see the connections. It fascinated me. So thank you for sharing and doing all that work to share that book with us.
I also wanted to show that I choose different topics to write about. I don't just write about my kindergarten teacher through 13 books of poetry. I
Right.
have different things.
I think it's an important book. Um, I've often wondered, have you ever had a publisher suggest that one of your poems shouldn't be a part of the collection, or do they abide by the way you've put the book of poetry together?
Mostly, but two editors have told me, like in the Mozart book, the editor didn't want 4 poems to be in the book. And of course, I was in awe of him because he was married to Joyce Carol Oates. He died, unfortunately. But I got my gumption up, and I said, okay, 3, well, I'll take 3 out, but the 4th one has to be in this selection. And then he said, and I would like 2 more poems about so-and-so. And so I thought, no problem, because I had 150 some poems and I only chose about 60. So I just shuffled through old poems, found what he wanted, and there you go. The,
Wow.
the other time was much more recent. Norton Press here in Minneapolis said, I sent in a manuscript, and one of the poems was about Hitler. And the publisher said, Norton Stone, no poem about Hitler in anything that I published. But it was meant to be a funny poem. And just thinking you might ask me that, I would like to read you just a part of a
Yeah.
poem by Hitler that Szymborska, my idol, wrote. And this is the mood that I was trying to get in my funny poem about Hitler. But she does it much better, and I won't read it all of it, but you'll get the idea just from the
Okay.
first. This is called Hitler's First Photograph. And who's this little fellow in his itty-bitty robe? That's tiny baby Adolf, the Hitler's little boy. Will he grow up to be an LLD or a tenor in Vienna's opera house? Whose teensy hand is this? Whose little ear and eye and nose? Whose tummy full of milk? We just don't know. Printers, doctors, merchants, priests? Where will those tootsie wootsies finally wander? To a garden, to a school, to an office, to a bride? Maybe to the Burgermeister's daughter? And that extreme irony and silliness, and you, listener, reader, knowing all the time. But there was a time when he was a itsy bitsy little boy, a terrible itsy bitsy little boy. I mean, grew up to. So that was she doesn't write like that all the time. a lot of time, but she puts that kind of a thing in there every once in a while. And I love that. She's using humor instead of writing a poem about this terrible person. We all
Right.
know he was terrible. So she gets at it in a different way.
Yeah. And really forces us to think and examine deeply how a life is shaped.
Right.
Yeah. How did it turn out with your Hitler poem? Is it in the book?
No, he did not. I never forgot that he told me no Hitler poems, so it's fine.
Okay.
I think it's kind of a good poem, though. I don't have any little itsy bitsy tootsy wootsies in it, but I have him trying after Berlin is bombed and he was in the shelter in Berlin and he shot himself. He's on top of these ashes he's getting out of and he's trying to find God. He's going up into the. So anyway,
I would like to read that.
I don't have it handy, but
Okay.
find it, I will send it to you.
One of my very distinct memories is you speaking at the University of Minnesota, talking about the other Mozart, and you brought along the files of your research, and they were immensely thick. I was so impressed. I think about those folders a lot as I hear other people doing their research, and I always think, is it as much as Sharon did for the other Mozart? Um, and I know you've traveled abroad many times. You went to Germany to research that. How does
Yeah.
that primary source research help you?
Oh yeah, I had a Minnesota State Art Sport grant. I didn't tell him I asked for money for travel. I didn't tell them where I was traveling or whom I was researching because she wasn't a Minnesotan. But I had a grant to go to Austria, and the grant not only gives you money for the plane ticket, it gives you an in to come in through the door of a library and say, I have a grant to study,
Sure.
to do research on. And that is really invaluable. I mean, you could scrounge up money for the airline ticket. Unless you lie your way in, you can't really have that um, power behind you. So I loved that. I loved that research. The library was at the Mozarteum. It's just a library for Mozart. So everything in the library has to do with Mozart. And some of the books have to do, or some of the research has to do also with his sister, because they couldn't totally ignore her. I remember one day I was in the library window. I mean, it was brick and mortar, but it was like coming into a home. And the windows open out toward into the sky. And it was just wonderful. Anyway, one day this guy comes in to the library to show you, I'm telling you this to show you the library's expertise. One day a guy comes into the library. He is maybe, oh, he was an old man. He must have been 56 years old. And he has a suit on because older men, at least in those days, wore suits, even if they weren't working any longer. And he comes in, he goes to the librarian, and he says, I'm looking for the music to this song. And and she goes up to the shelves above to the little cupboards above the shelving, gets on the ladder, walks up, takes out a scroll, brings it down, and lays it open before him on the table. I mean, she knew every book and she knew exactly what was in the cupboards and she could identify it by ear and by eye. It was incredible. I have to tell you one more thing. I'm going on too long, but I had lunch sometimes with the people who worked in the library. It wasn't that they invited me, but they didn't mind that I sat at the table with them. And so they had a whole hour for lunch. When I worked, I had 23 minutes, including a bathroom break. And they unrolled their table, their cloth for their plate. They brought plates and they brought silverware and they brought a glass and they helped dish themselves up on the plate. And they had normal conversation as if they were in a restaurant. And then when they were done, they put everything back into their packet. And I thought, wow, I used to eat out of a sack when I wrote, when I worked. Pulled out a can of tuna or something,
Right.
gobbled that down, and so I had a really good time. What was the question? About libraries, I guess. I don't know.
I had asked about how primary research helped,
Oh
primary
yeah.
source.
Well, then also, besides me, that was research for me, Sharon, but for Nana Mozart, I took a cab out to where she lived, St. Gilgen, which wasn't in Salzburg. It was about 20 minutes away from Salzburg. And I got to go around the house she lived in. I got to see the lake, of course, that she would look at, that ruined her clavichord strings because it was too damp out there. I walked up the narrow steps she had to walk up when she was pregnant. They were very tricky. And it took me, what did I say, 20 miles, but 20 minutes, half hour at the most. It was a 6-day trip when she was alive because they were going up into the mountains and they were going by coach. And it was not a paved road. I mean, you have to imagine a dirt road with rocks in it. And I thought one of her biggest disappointments was to be so abandoned because she had been with Wolfgang in all of those courts in Europe and had been had received all these accolades for her. And then she was abandoned because she could no longer be a protege. Her breasts were growing, and it was obvious that she was no longer a girl. And so her father fixed up this arranged marriage with her for her at the age of 33. And I thought, that's exactly the age when Christ was crucified. And
Yeah.
she went out to take care of his children. And the dad, I will say this, he drew up a marriage contract and she was supposed to get 4 hours of a day to play the
Oh,
clavichord. Most very often she did not get 4 hours a day because if you've ever even babysat, you know that with 5 children, you're going to have to interrupt those 5 hours to do, or 4 hours to go work over here with the 5 children and pulling them apart. And she did have a cook. That was good.
I, if people watching this have not read that book, I strongly encourage them to do so. It is one of the most moving of the books that you have written, and it strongly made me think about sisters and ambition and
Mm-hmm.
what happens to ambition when we don't have any control over our lives. So
Right. Well, and that book came out in just toward the tail end when women were really pushing this. We have now other social issues, but that book just aimed at that. And in a way, that was part of the plan in my head too. I wanted to show young women that it hasn't always been as easy. Not that it's easy today, but
No,
it was a heck of a lot harder in those days.
it was. Yes. I always tell people we used to have help wanted ads for men and for women. And that speaks volumes to me too. Um, I I hope that we will continue to hear you doing readings around the Twin Cities area. I know you go out to North Dakota and South Dakota and
Mhm.
you read as well. Do you have any future trips in mind?
Well, I don't read as often out there, but yes, I do. Uh, I'm going, I'm going to, when when Duet in the Little Blue Church was published, I breathed a sigh of relief because I thought, okay, if I keel over now, at least I've got this backlog. So I thought, I really need to do a reading in my hometown library in South Dakota, Mobridge, because that's where my reading started. I just happened as a 9-year-old, a 10-year-old. In those days, I don't know what happened, but there wasn't any danger of somebody yanking you out of off the street and raping you, It's
No.
just so I was walking around town, saw this building, went inside. Ah, look at all the books. It smelled so good. It was cool in there because the floors were marble and it was really quite a building. And the A.H. Brown Library. So when the librarian showed me some books for people my age, oh my God. So that's where my whole reading career began. So I thought, okay, this book, Duet in the Little Brew House Church, this might be the end. So I will be reading out in the Mobridge Library in May. And on my way out, if everything goes all right, I'll stop at the Watertown and read at the DDR bookstore, which I highly recommend if you're driving around Watertown, South Dakota. And I requested a reading at the South Dakota Book Fair, Book Fest. I don't know if I'll get it, but so that would be in Brookings. And I have possibly something for North Dakota, but it's so iffy that I don't want to go any farther.
Okay. Well, I know the people around here are always excited to hear when you're going to be reading, and you are often on stage with several other poets, and it's a complete evening of inspiration. So I hope people will seek you out. And I
Yeah.
thank you for sharing your experiences, your feelings with us today. It matters a lot to me that you've done this. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Vicki. I appreciate your work with video and your friendship. Thank you.